We are on time, but we can wait maybe a couple of minutes for more people to join. But in order to be fair to the audience who arrive on time, I would like to start introducing Dr. Lisa Salinas, who is a professor here at UTRGV. She's also a RCMAR scholar, which is really good to have you here, Lisa. She's a licensed and registered dietitian, nutritionist, and clinical assistant. So she got her bachelor's and PhD degrees from Rutgers University in New Jersey. She's a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Dietetics of the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And she's researching on pulses, diet quality, food insecurity, and health education implementation, which is very needed here in the Valley. And well, I don't have a lot of details on you, Lisa, but it's going to be really interesting to hear about this phenomena about pulses in food and diet. And yeah, so you're working on the intake of dietary pulses and cognitive health in the Asian population. So we are really proud to have you here, really glad to have you here. And well, welcome everybody who is joining the audience. And we can start right away. So we will be doing good use of the time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ellie. I really appreciate those words and the introduction. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen so we could get started. Let's see. Just make sure that I have this correct. Okay. Let's see. All right. Do you see the full screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. Okay, wonderful. Well, as Dr. Ellie alluded to, I am here today to talk to you a little bit about pulses, but there's going to be so much more, so we'll get started. So I wanted to just give you some idea of who I am, because some of you do not know me, so I wanted to introduce myself. I'll be defining something called diet quality. I'm going to somewhat defend the idea that pulses might be this kind of hidden superhero in our food supply. I'm going to go ahead and connect pulses with diet quality. And then I'm going to make a suggestion that it's possible that pulses might very well help us with our brain and brain function. So who am I? This was already discussed a little bit, but I am a licensed and registered dietitian nutritionist. That was kind of my first role out as a professional. And then I soon learned that I did want to incorporate research and teaching into my day, which is why I went ahead and earned a PhD in nutritional sciences. I've been working at UTRGV as a clinical assistant professor now for about 7 years. I'm working on my culinary medicine certification, which I won't touch on today, but it is something that I feel like is important in my own research story. And my research interests are pretty diverse, but my main focus is wanting to improve diet quality in many different populations and really try to prevent chronic disease. So let's go ahead and start defining diet quality. So there's this nice little diagram that was created by Alker-Wee, and it really is quite comprehensive in terms of what does diet quality mean. Today, I really am going to focus on kind of this quadrant right here, which is really in terms of adequacy, diversity, moderation, overall balance, dietary balance, anti-inflammatory profile, nutrient density, and antioxidant capacity. But it would behoove me to not mention this, the other components of diet quality, which can impact intake. So things like food safety, making sure we have a safe food supply, organoleptic. We have to appreciate the fact that we do want to enjoy what we eat. And then there's a socioculture aspect, which is how does culture play into how we eat and what we eat. So I do want to give those some face time, but today I'll be mainly talking about that nutritional diet quality. And so what in fact does that mean? So it's really food and nutrient consumption for adequate nutrition and optimal health. And so we're all aware that things like hypertension, obesity, hypercholesterolemia, and inflammation do have this really special relationship with cognitive health. And there is this suggestion that higher diet quality will decrease risk for all of those conditions or disease states. In addition, there's a suggestion that better diet quality will improve cognitive performance and as well as slow epigenetic age acceleration. So this is a really busy slide, but I wanted to kind of inform you. If you've ever heard the phrase diet quality, you might be familiar with some dietary indexes that or indices that exist. And these are ways that we can look at an overall dietary pattern and determine if they meet certain criteria. And so you'll see quite a number of them in the nutrition literature. Things like healthy eating index, that might be familiar. There's the Mediterranean diet score. So that is a score that shows how well somebody's eating pattern relates to the Mediterranean diet. There's the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, or the DASH diet score. So that DASH is a specific diet, and that diet score is meant to evaluate how well does somebody adhere to the DASH diet. So I wanted to let you know there's a lot of different ways we can measure diet quality. Today, I'll be focusing mainly on what we call the alternative or alternate healthy eating index 2010. And the reason for this is the way this index was created was taking into consideration those food categories that have been linked either positively or negatively with chronic disease risk. So it might come as no surprise. We see things like vegetables, fruit, whole grains, nuts and legumes, and you know I'm going to focus a lot of that on that legume name right there. Long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, so those omega-3 fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and then on the flip side, so those are the food categories that we really are looking for adherence to. And then the food categories where the score will remove points is these categories on the right. So you'll see sugar sweetened beverages and juice, red or processed meat, trans fat, sodium, and alcohol. So why is it that I'm going to talk more about that index than any of the other indices? Well, it's because there's some evidence to suggest a connection with cognitive health. So we're going to start with a study that came out in 2020, and this was in middle-aged and older US Hispanics and Latinos of diverse backgrounds. And it was recognized that there were independent of variables that contribute to cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease, better diet quality was associated with higher global cognition, verbal learning, and verbal memory. These associations were the strongest in the Mexican and Puerto Rican subgroups. And the suggestion from the authors was this was related to higher intake of fruits and vegetables and moderate alcohol intake. So that was in 2020. Now, the study that, and I want to emphasize the importance of subject population in these studies. So the study that I just mentioned was done in a Hispanic population. The study I'm about to talk about is hot and fresh off the press. However, it is very important that you know that the information that was gathered in this study is from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And if you're not familiar with those cohorts, these are very, very large cohorts that have been followed for many, many years. But they are about 93% non-Hispanic white individuals in these cohorts. And that's really important and something that really speaks to the generalizability of results. I still think it offers an opportunity for hypothesis generation, but it is important that I make mention of that. So in this case, and you may have even seen this in the headlines, so the suggestion was, what is the diet that is most related to healthy aging? Okay, so they took a look at this large prospective cohort study. They combined these cohorts because actually the NHS focuses on women and the HPFS focuses on men. These were adults aged 40 to 70. And what they were doing was investigating the association between long-term dietary patterns and healthy aging. So what did they mean by healthy aging? Well, it was survival free of major chronic diseases and preserved physical and cognitive function, right? So we all want quality of life throughout our whole existence, right? And that's really what they were focusing on. So it turns out what they found was the dietary pattern that was most predictive of healthy aging closely aligned with this alternative healthy eating index. So this healthy eating index, as we've already talked about, does incorporate a high intake of vegetables, including those legumes, whole grains, and unsaturated fats and plant-based proteins. So you can see I've underlined the hot topic of today, which is that I'm going to be narrowing down my focus for a little bit of time to pulses or beans, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. It also reflects a low intake of red and processed meats and sugar-sweetened beverages. And so the suggestion from the authors is that healthy aging comes from a diet of plant-based foods or a plant-forward diet with a moderate intake of healthy animal-based foods. So when we talk about healthy animal-based foods, we typically talk about chicken, we talk about fish, we talk about low-fat dairy products. And there was a quote from the paper that says higher consumption of legumes and whole plant foods contributed to the AHEI pattern's superiority. So this is a little busy, but I just wanted to show you, okay, so what were they comparing this alternative healthy eating index against? Well, it was actually against a number of different dietary indices that we already talked about. And so what I need to show you is that it turns out that many of these diets have a positive impact on healthy aging. It just so happened that it was AHEI that had the most impactful, most impact on healthy aging, as well as cognitive health. So there was healthy aging overall, and then it was intact cognitive health. Okay, so we're going to shift gears slightly, and we're going to talk about perhaps my favorite topic, which is pulses. And that's why you're all here today. I just know it. So what are pulses, just in case you're not familiar? So I talked a little bit before about legumes, and legumes are a much bigger category of food that are more like an umbrella group, I call it. And so pulses are a subgroup of legumes. And the reason that I like to make sure to be very specific about where my interests lie is that there are things within the legume category that will impact the benefit or lack thereof of this food category. And as much as soy is a wonderful high quality protein source, it does behave somewhat differently than the category of pulses. So when I my research focus really is on this subgroup, which is pulses. So this is dry beans, dry peas, chickpeas, and lentils. So how are pulses nutritious? Well, they are really filled with many different things, some of which include protein, fiber, folate, iron, phosphorus, a small amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, calcium, copper, magnesium, and potassium. In addition, they're actually a great source of antioxidants, and certainly people do not discuss that enough. So pulses are what we in the nutrition world would call a nutrient-dense food category. So we have calorie-dense, which is a food that offers many calories but not very much nutrition. And then we have nutrient-dense, which is typically a lower calorie food item that offers a lot of different nutrition. So they are what we would call nutrient-dense. So let's bring together the two topics we've just discussed so far. We talked about diet quality. We talked about pulses. Is there a story between them? Well, in fact, there is. So first, I want to bring you back to the diagrams or the figures that I showed you before. These are the exact same figures. But what I want to show you now is all of these different diets that have the little star next to them happen to emphasize legumes, beans, or pulses. So just to remind you, this paper was exploring many different types of what we call diets or eating patterns that impart health. I mentioned, as you can see from the numbers, they all have some good effect on healthy aging or cognitive health, some of them more than others. But I just want to emphasize the fact that legumes play and pulses play a role in all of those that I've indicated right here. In addition, there has been work done where they've established that pulse intake actually improved the overall nutrient density of adult consumers. And so there was a paper done not too long ago, and at all levels of pulse consumption, consumers versus non-consumers had higher energy adjusted intake of fiber, folate, and magnesium. And then for consumers at intakes of greater or equal to 70 grams per day, and we'll get to that in a second, because you're sitting there saying, well, what does that mean? Versus for non-consumers, higher energy adjusted intakes observed for potassium, zinc, iron, choline, and resulted in a lower intake of fat overall. And so, well, what does 70 grams mean? Well, this is approximately 1/3 of a cup of pulses per day. So not an enormous amount, but I will tell you, it's not what most people are doing. So that's really important to think about. So can pulses help our brain? So getting back to how, what are pulses made of, and how does that relate to cognition? So I will admit that I am extrapolating here. So, again, I'm just trying to drive hypotheses. I'm not trying to make any grandiose claims. However, I will say that pulses have protein, they have fiber, they have folate, they have copper, and then they have calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And when we look at those particular nutrients and their relationship with cognitive health, it turns out all of these tend to be protective in some way or another against subjective cognitive decline, cognitive performance, global cognition, all-cause dementia. So again, I'm extrapolating, but it's something interesting to think about. So also fairly hot off the press is some work that was done in preparation for the newest version of the dietary guidelines for Americans. And this was accomplished by Booth et al. And so the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee conducted a systematic review in hopes of driving those new dietary guidelines. And the question, amongst many questions that they ask, was, what is the relationship between dietary patterns consumed and risk of cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and mild cognitive impairment? Okay, and so what they did is, and this is what they do with each iteration of the dietary guidelines, the dietary guidelines come out every 5 years. And so what does that mean in terms of what articles are they going to be reflecting on for the new dietary guidelines? Well, what they do is they start their reflection when the last dietary guidelines ended, right? And so they're now looking at the information between, or I should say, when they look at the articles starting where the investigation ended for the last dietary guidelines. That's how I should say it. So these are articles published between March 2020 and January 2024, and they excluded that information from prior reviews. Excuse me, they included information from prior reviews if they met their updated inclusion criteria. Before I reflect on some of their findings, I wanted to just make sure that everybody is somewhat aware of some of the different diets that exist out there. One of which or two of which we already mentioned, which is the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. We talked about that already. The Mediterranean diet, you can see kind of the components there. The DASH diet is really focused towards prevention and treatment of hypertension. And then we have the MIND diet, which is on the right. And that diet has actually been created and incorporated concepts from both of the diets on the left. So the MIND diet is really a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. But of course, what is your friendly pulse lover going to say in this regard? And I'm going to just point out that in all of these diets, which we're going to reflect on a little bit more, legumes or beans play a key part in those specific diets. So in regards to the findings on the Mediterranean diet, it was suggested by these authors that higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet is generally associated with reduced cognitive decline and dementia risk. Some studies show greater benefits when the Mediterranean diet is not combined with a Western dietary pattern. We're going to talk about that Western dietary pattern in a little bit, but the bottom line is Western dietary pattern tends to be higher in meat, sugar sweetened beverages, and things of that nature. And the reason these authors felt that they had mixed findings when it came to the Mediterranean diet is because there is always going to be differences in how people adhere to the diet. And then there are various ways that people score how compliant somebody is on this particular diet. As far as the DASH diet, there was some research suggesting a protective effect against severe subjective cognitive decline, while other studies reported null associations. And then the authors indicated that in the longer follow-up periods, there were inconsistent trends. As far as the MIND diet was concerned, they talked about a 2-year randomized controlled trial that showed favorable difference in global cognition, but the results were not statistically significant at all time points. The cohort studies suggest an inverse association between high MIND diet adherence and dementia risk. And there is a variation across cohorts. And we always have to remember that, not every study is done in the same population. So that's something to consider when conducting a systematic review. They also did some work and they accomplished some factor or cluster analysis, and they found that a healthy dietary pattern, so the way they defined healthy was high in vegetables, legumes, nuts, fish, and fruit, are linked to better episodic memory, And I told you that we would talk a little bit about that Western dietary pattern. Well, this is a pattern where it's high in unhealthy foods like meats, refined grains, sugar sweetened beverages, and sweets or desserts. And it's associated with adverse cognitive outcomes. Okay, so you have this opposing impact. Again, this is all information from that systematic review. So they also made mention of something that you may have come across in your travels, which is a concept of ultra-processed dietary intake or ultra-processed foods. So what are ultra-processed foods? They are groups of foods within that Western dietary pattern. They tend to be higher in energy, salt, sugar, saturated fat, and they have lower levels of dietary fiber, micronutrients, and vitamins. And these would be what we would call calorie-dense foods. So this systematic review found that these foods were generally associated with poorer cognitive function and increased risk of decline. In this same systematic review, they called out that AHEI again, and now this is linked to better fluid intelligence in some studies. I wanted to just circle back on, the story of the pulses and just call out a paper that was in fact not included in the systematic review, and that is because it was published right before that cutoff that they used. But I still think it's something that is relatively new information, and again, hypothesis driving. So it was in this study that they investigated the relationship between dietary protein intake and cognitive function using NHANES data, which is a dietary survey that is conducted in the United States. And legume protein intake was positively associated with better cognitive function. But they made sure to also indicate that total dietary protein, total animal protein, meat and eggs also positively correlated with cognitive function. And this is all going to come together when I talk about kind of my own next steps. But that's obviously something important to talk about. They did mention that milk and dairy products showed a negative association with cognitive performance. So that is a slightly older paper from 2020, and it was not included in the review. Now, another paper that was not included in the review is a paper that bears mentioning because, like good scientists, we all want to make sure that we're looking at the whole body of evidence, right? And we don't want to, just because I love pulses and think that everybody should be eating them, doesn't mean that I'm not going to look at data that might suggest otherwise. So this is just an important study to take a look at. It was done in China, and it looked at quartiles of intake as a percent of energy. And so the reason that this is important is that they did find that a higher plant protein intake, which of course includes beans, was associated with a greater cognitive decline. So there was this kind of theory that the more that the plant protein substituted for animal protein, it was associated with greater cognitive decline. And they also mentioned that grain protein intake was negatively linked to cognition while animal protein was protective. So again, I'm going to circle back on this, but what I, kind of a little bit of a spoiler is that this does give some merit to the idea of we don't need to go out into the community and convince somebody to become a vegetarian or to become a vegan to support high quality health. Maybe it's about more of a plant forward lifestyle or just less of certain food items. So I am a human researcher through and through. I do not study mice. I do not work with bacteria or anything like that. But of course, when new research comes out about pulses, I'm on top of it, even if it is in mice. So it is interesting to talk about this study that came out recently that in mice where it talked about resistant starches from pulses and how they improved neurocognitive health via a gut microbiome brain axis, again, in an aged mice population. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this data, but what it suggests is that these fibers that are coming from dietary pulses might be interacting and increasing gut bacteria that then positively impacts the brain of these mice. But as I showed you on the left-hand side of my slide, I just want to acknowledge the fact that humans are in fact not mice. So we have to take that again as moving us forward in science, but making sure not to make big assumptions. Okay, so how is this kind of all intertwined into what I've been working on as a RCMAR scholar? And I wanted to share just a little bit of information that I've managed to analyze through my work as a scholar over the last year. Given my interest in diet quality and in pulses, I had the real benefit of working with some data that was collected through the Maracaibo aging study. And I had a couple of hypotheses that I wanted to explore. My first hypothesis was pulse consumption in an aging Venezuelan population will be lower than the recommended intake, and baseline pulse intake will be associated with higher performance on baseline cognitive assessments. And so I'm going to just take you through a little bit of that. But before I do want to show you some data that has been provided through Tufts University, and it shows, now this is in 2019, so a different time frame than the data that I used for my study. But this shows the intake or lack thereof of various food categories, including fruits, vegetables, and legumes. And I took a little bit of a next step just to orient you, because the percentages are great, but sometimes we'd like to see what does that mean in terms of amounts, right? And so just so you're aware on this graph, that target, that 100% for fruit is 200 grams, and that's equivalent to approximately 1 cup. The target for vegetables is 300 grams, and that is equivalent to approximately 1.5 cups. And the target for legumes is 100 grams, which is about 1/2 cup. So just to orient you on that. But you can basically see that there's low intake pretty much across the board, right? So cut to my own work with the Maracaibo aging study data. And as it turns out that there was a very low intake of legumes in this cohort. As you can see, I've indicated kind of where that recommended intake amount would be. And you can see most people are on that left-hand side, which is somewhere between 0 and 17 grams. What I also did was I took a look at, oops, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Oh, I've lost my, okay, sorry. I took a look at total vegetable intake. And so what I did here was I did include legumes in that category, but I removed tubers. Now, tubers are mostly potatoes and foods that are in that category. And I removed them because in many populations around the world, the way we eat potatoes is very diverse, but we oftentimes are frying them in some capacity. So I oftentimes like to look at my vegetable category with and without potatoes because it allows me to kind of see, is it mostly fried potatoes that are being consumed? And it turns out that that was in fact the case in this population. And so you can see that the recommended intake of that legumes, vegetables category is where I've put the arrow, and then everybody kind of found themselves to the left of that arrow. So that low intake. In terms of fruits, I did remove the category of bananas and plátanos or plantains, just to evaluate the other fruits in that category, because it did turn out that most of the fruit intake was from plantains. And plantains are an amazing food, but once again, oftentimes it is a circumstance where they're being fried. And so they can sometimes act a little bit differently in our systems. It would be very important to mention at this time that there's intake is multifactorial. We reflected on that a little bit at the beginning of the talk. But it's really important that we acknowledge how much food insecurity can impact food intake and dietary intake. And so, again, this is from data that is much more updated than the data from the Maracaibo Aging Study, but food insecurity has been an issue for some time now, and it's just important to acknowledge that as a reason why intake may not be as high as us dietitians or nutritionists might like it to be. So I think that's a really important piece of every food intake story. And it is something that when I collect data, it is something that I try to incorporate that into my data collection because I do think that's really important. So in regards to my second hypothesis, which is pulse intake and its association with performance on cognitive tests. These were the cognitive tests that were run in this particular cohort. And what we did here, I did some work with a wonderful biostatistician named Dr. Juan Lopez Alvarenga. And what we decided to do, because the category of legumes or pulses, because the intake was so low, we worked on a factor analysis and we grouped foods together. And so I do not want to pretend like I'm making any claims from this information. I do think it's just interesting in moving forward. So you can see in this particular cognitive function test, so this is global cognition. You can see this is where that factored group that included legumes fell, which implies, again, not making any claims, but implies that higher legume intake was related to a higher performance on this test. And we see a similar pattern with total memory, with long-term memory, with short-term memory, and recognition memory. So again, not making any claims, but I think it's interesting in moving forward. And that brings me to my next slide, which is kind of what my plans are moving forward in my investigation of diet quality, as well as pulses and their relationship with cognitive decline and chronic disease. So I have a couple of different items on my agenda, one of which is to maybe investigate a larger data set We have the NHANES, which I mentioned before, which is US based. And then there is NSANUT, which is a database in Mexico that collects a lot of the same information. And it would be really interesting to examine my same hypotheses, but with that data set. I also would like to, in moving forward, focus on that relationship with diet quality and cognitive function in our very own Hispanic population in the Rio Grande Valley. And, this is one last, very short statement, and I alluded to this before, but the data to me are really pointing me in the direction of, if there were to be any intervention work, this idea of making small changes to have big impact. And so my thought is small changes would be improving pulse intake in the population, at the same time decreasing that ultra processed food intake to see that kind of impact on cognitive decline and chronic disease risk. Something that we oftentimes think about as dietitians is how can we help somebody make small changes, because sometimes those big changes are really difficult and they seem like mountains that cannot be overcome. So if we provide education in small little baby steps, then that might have a bigger impact. So that's kind of my thoughts moving forward. And that's all I have for you today. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and would obviously field any questions or comments.
Oh, this is amazing. Thank you for this super interesting analysis and explanation of some features that I didn't know that exist in even analyzing our own database. So this is amazing. I'd like to open the floor to the audience if anybody has questions for Dr. Salinas. Dr. Maestre.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salinas. It's very, very informative. I've even took some pictures of your slides, so I share it with my daughter, who is a vegan. And she said, "I told you so, Mom." But anyhow, I wanted to ask you, what about people that have some kind of intolerance? And how is this intolerance? Is this age related? Might be age related?
So you're talking about intolerance to beans. Is that
Yes.
what you're referring to? So I'm so glad you asked, and I didn't reflect on this in my talk, but I do think we have an interesting attitude and relationship with beans overall. And there is some limited data to suggest that the adverse effects that people feel from beans is not as significant as they think. And that seems it seems kind of strange to say that, right? It's a subjective feeling. The other issue, and this is something that we as dietitians oftentimes counsel on, which is when it comes to fiber, there's some important things to keep in mind. Number one, you never ever want to go from 0 to 60 in a day's time. That can be very uncomfortable for even the biggest pulse lover, such as myself, right? So you never want to go from I'm eating very, very little fiber to I'm eating 30 grams of fiber in a day, right? So I do think that's happening more often than we would think. In addition, the importance of hydration in fiber intake and how that can also impact its influence on our gut. Thirdly, and lastly, it's important to think about when we are having what we would call adverse effects. Sometimes that actually means we're making some really awesome compounds that might have some really great impact on our systems. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. And I would say just slow and steady for people that feel that they really have that impact on their system. I also want to say, just really quickly, I have met a number of people who also tell me how poorly they feel after they've had a really solid meal at a fast food restaurant, right? So sometimes it's hard to think about how that's kind of weighed out, right? They're willing to not feel great after that meal, but you know, so there's obviously I have a lot of feelings about that.
And is it this kind of uncomfortable side effects increases with age? I mean, I only see older adults in my,
Of course, of course.
work.
So our gastric motility slows with age, and so I imagine that that's probably why you're hearing this from individuals, is that it's just not moving through as quickly as it used to, right? So I imagine that's probably playing into what you're seeing out there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Dr. Fuchs?
Hello.
Hello.
Lisa, what a wonderful presentation. Who doesn't like legumes? I mean, I love them. I love them. We've never talked before. So my specialization is in chronic pain.
Okay.
And pain is the number one reason why people go to the doctor, is because they're experiencing pain. And it is a disease in and itself. I do know that there has been a lot of work looking at the relationship of diet and chronic pain. However, I can't keep up to date on everything, even in my own field. So could you give it just a short, sort of a brief summary of your understanding of the impact of legumes on chronic pain and the positive impact it might have?
I just want to tell you that is definitely the first time I have ever received a question like that. So my short answer is going to be, I'll get back to you. My longer answer, and I tread lightly on this because I think that TikTok has gone a little overboard in this regard, but there is this idea of inflammation from the diet. And so that is clearly something that would impact pain, right? Or contribute to pain, or certainly not, impact pain in some way or another. So the idea is these higher diet quality eating patterns tend to be less inflammatory than those of more of the Western dietary pattern. I think that's as far as I'll take that, just because I don't like to make things up.
Well, I'll do a quick. I can take a peek. By the way, so I'm on the other side. I utilize preclinical models in my research, and I don't talk to people very often. So I think I'm going to look into the resistant starches to see if anyone's ever looked at them in various animal models that we use in pain. So maybe I'll follow up with you and talk to you in some more detail. Thank you for your talk.
Absolutely. I just want to, just for everybody's own personal nutrition knowledge, a little bit off track, but in terms of resistant starch, if you've heard about that, it's been kind of a newer thing that people are talking about in the literature. And what's interesting is that you can actually yourself increase the amount of resistant starch in what you're eating. For example, if you were to make rice today and you leave it in your fridge overnight, tomorrow that rice will have a greater amount of resistant starch. The same goes for pasta, potatoes. So that in and of itself is just fascinating to me, that you can actually increase essentially the fiber content of what you're consuming. And especially with now us knowing the importance of gut health and its impact on so many things that are, I mean, perhaps even, chronic pain, but certainly other chronic diseases. So that's more of just a little side
So do you mean it's
bit of
good?
information.
It's good to do that?
Yes, which is hard because obviously it's changing a little bit the mouthfeel, right? So some people actually dislike day-old rice or day-old pasta, but nutritionally speaking, it's not a bad idea.
Hmm.
The justification for leftovers now.
Yeah,
That's
there you
great.
go.
Yes. Well,
On
don't feel
top
guilty
of that.
don't feel bad in taking the leftover next day. It's a good
There
thing.
you go.
Yeah, we have another question here from Barbara Flores. Says, thank you for this information, Dr. Salinas. Who was wondering, which of the pulses do you think is the most nutrition dense?
Oh gosh. Okay. So in terms of antioxidant content, it does tend to, it seems like the black beans and the kidney beans tend to have slightly more antioxidants. However, my feeling is we're not eating enough of these things in general. We're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. We're not eating enough beans in general. So my feeling is if you can incorporate any of these beans into your diet, you're better off. So while, chemically there might be a little bit more of this or a little bit more of this in these different pulses, I think that just adding any that are appealing to you would be the most important piece.
Hmm. That made me think about what you said about mixing the dietary patterns with the Western diet. So you are telling us increase healthier components anyhow, but if you really want to make a difference, you need to commit to one pattern. Yeah?
Ish. Yes. I mean, those dietary patterns, I didn't go into the details of them. There's a lot of overlap, and you may have seen that a little bit in the chart that I created with those Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet and all that. So there's definitely some overlap, right? The common themes are fruits, vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy, sometimes a little bit of alcohol on one side, and then the other side is typically refined grains and sugar sweetened beverages and processed or red meat. So that's kind of the grander themes here.
Do you think that there may be any connection between the microbiome and the response to these pulses and to the content? Because in different places, the microbiome may be completely different. For example, in South America, the microbiome of people is definitely way bigger than the one that we have here, including some possible pathogens that people get used to them. Okay, so but they can also help in other ways to degrade nutrients and these things. What do you think about that interaction with the microbiome that may be possible?
I think it's absolutely possible. I think there's so much about the gut we still don't understand, and how people are different in what is going on in their guts, and how different populations differ in their gut. I think there's a lot to explore, and I think you bring up an interesting point, that it very well might be that certain people who maybe haven't been exposed to certain foods have one reaction, right? Whereas if you are somebody who traditionally, has grown up and consumed these foods over time, maybe there's just an accommodation and an adaptation of your gut.
Questions
And
here?
to follow a little bit on that, w- how do you introduce pulses in early life? What's the best way?
Well, I'm just going to tell you from my own personal experience, but I feel like I would surely give the same recommendation if I were seeing a client. At first, I did basically make a non spiced hummus, so I would just blenderize the pulses. In the very beginning, what I would do is I would use dry beans and cook them from dry, because those are going to be the lowest sodium containing beans, right? So when early life, you don't want to expose the children to too much sodium, right? So I would take the dry beans, I would soak them, and I would cook them, and I would blenderize them. As they got to be in their finger food stages, I gave them beans on their tray, and they just would eat them just like that. And I'm not embarrassed to say that to this day, my children are 10 and 12. Sometimes, as a part of a meal, I will have rinsed a can of beans and I will put some in a dish and they will eat it just like that.
Mm. And how old, when they are, what age should they start?
So the general rule is to not introduce food before the age of 6 months. Some people say 4. I'm still on the 6-month bandwagon. I would say probably closer to the 8, 9, 10-month mark is probably when I'd start giving them the puree of the beans.
And for adults, that hummus count as a...
Absolutely. I even have a recipe I could give you. Absolutely. Yep.
Oh, I think that's wonderful, because we are so used to saying if it's not raw, it's not the real thing.
Does the method of preparation impact like the nutritional value of the pulses? Because, for example, like I know that if you take like a vegetable that's frozen, the nutritional value is different compared to a fresh vegetable. So I was just wondering if like there's a similar situation with pulses, or if the method of cooking them.
So in general, when we talk about fruits and vegetables, anything in those categories, any kind of processing, and I'm not using processing in any other way, but to say that we usually have to do something with a food before it's ready for consumption, right? So that's processing. And that's actually why they came up with the term ultra processed, by the way, is because we needed a way to differentiate between, okay, are we talking about a can of beans? Because that's been processed, right? That's been cooked, salt has been added, it's in a can, so it's been processed. But how different that is from a bag of chips, right? So that's why they've come up with those terms like ultra processed. You're always running a risk when you're applying heat or some kind of method to a fruit or vegetable. You're always running the risk of decreasing vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and things like that. So this is why, as dietitians, we always make sure to encourage a variety of foods, right? So you're not just eating the same thing day after day after day. So you're getting different vitamins and minerals from different sources. And it's just kind of a reality. There's some fruits and vegetables where applying heat actually improves their bioavailability. And a great example of that is tomatoes. So when you process tomatoes, when you cook tomatoes, the lycopene, which is this wonderful antioxidant, it actually is more bioavailable than if you were to eat a raw tomato. So sometimes the heat is helpful, but you're absolutely right that it will impact that overall.
Do you have any recipe for frijoles charros?
I do. To admit, when I make frijoles charros, I try to be very traditionalist, so I do add bacon.
Okay. A real bacon or turkey bacon?
Real bacon, real bacon. And it's been approved by my Mexican in-laws, so I feel like I've really made it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. We'll
Great.
take home literally what we learned today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Nina, do we have the announcement for next week? Okay. Okay, we have some announcements here. Okay, we have our next seminar of this series is going to be on April 22nd at the same time, 3:30. Our presenter is going to be Dr. Daniel Sullivan. Going to be talking about psychological stress, community resilience, and chronic environmental contamination. Look for the Zoom link in the appointment sent by Neira. Also, we are looking for affiliates for the our group. We have did it for the RCMAR, no? Neira.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So we have access to Alzheimer's disease resources, collaborative opportunities, consulting services within the scope of the center. And please, if you're interested, contact Claudia Alanis for more information. And there's a deep read update. They may be from Dr. Maestro for sure.
Yes, yes, thank
Please,
you.
tell us.
So the Dementia Prevention Research Institute of Texas, that's the bill, is the bill, Senate Bill SB 5, passed the Senate, and it's now waiting for the House to approve, but already 126 out of 150 of the House representatives have co-signed the bill. This means that this bill will probably pass, and the importance of this is that it will bring 3 billion over 10 years, meaning $300 million to study dementia prevention in Texas. And we should be ready to put our ideas on how to prevent primary, secondary, and tertiary. And this is going to be this money will be distributed among the institutions via grant awards. So we need to think, how can we be ready to compete? The very first one, and we're going to keep everybody updated, but of course, this first need to be approved and pass for next year, but we are already preparing our portfolios given that this tremendous opportunity, and we understand that when you hit first, you hit harder, we say in Spanish, and we need to be ready. And I think that nutrition component will be a fantastic project, and hopefully, Lisa, as a continuation and extension of your studies, hopefully we can, on this topic of nutrition and pulses, that is so much, I think, relevant for the population of South Texas, for everybody. But given the high consumption, I think that would be interesting. So we always say, well, we need to be ready in these times of uncertainty. We also see some positives, and we wanted to highlight that as a positive for our state, and encourage everyone with ideas to reach out and to start thinking and planning and putting resources. I haven't seen any other than cancer initiatives like this. So I think it's becoming a stronger field as, I guess, our legislators age and as the general population age. And it's very obvious that this is really a tsunami among us, among everyone in South Texas. I think there is no family that is spared of something like memory decline or cognitive impairment. So thank you so much. I hope to see you all guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.